Hi everyone, welcome to episode number 30 of the Build Podcast, and today we'll be going through closure tools. So what is a closure tool? It is a set of tools made by the Google developer team, and it is basically divided into 4 parts. The first one is a compiler that we'll be going through a large part of the compiler in this episode. Then there are also library and templates, and lastly there's Lint, which we'll also touch a little bit. Therefore, for this episode, we'll be concentrating on the closure compiler and the linter. Now, before we go on, let's take a look at the project for this episode. It is a very simple project. It is all about CSS names or CSS color names. So let's go ahead and choose some color here. Let's say this one, the powder blue here, and come back right here, and I'm gonna click powder blue. And you'll have a little slider here, and as you drag it to the right, it will go towards white, and as you drag it to the left, it will go towards black. Or you can even use hex color values, something like this, and it will give you the same effect. What I like about this little project is that it gives both the RGB values as well as the hex values, as well as a little bit of percentage on lighten and darken the colors, and this can be related to some kind of CSS preprocessors. So I hope you like the little project. It's really simple, and let's go ahead and look at the project folder firstly. So I have already created the project folder into my desktop here, and look at the folder structure. It just consists of 2 files, which are basically index.html and script.js. Let's go into the text editor and take a look at it. So inside the index.html, it is pretty simple, very minimal. It has a little bit of styles right at the top, and the body is extremely simple. And lastly, you have CDN, which goes to jQuery to pull the jQuery library, and we are using jQuery to write a little script.js. Let's go inside the script.js, which is also relatively simple. Here I am initiating a color object, where inside I have a few variables. For example, the color input, which is a string variable. This is used to capture the string input by the user, as well as an array of numbers, which we use to convert this string variable into the RGB components. And of course, after that, we have a few functions to display it and calculate the colors and so on and so forth. And lastly, towards the end, we are also kind of calling it color.inputColor to take in the user input. As you can see, the project is really simple because we are concentrating on learning the closure tools that we'll be using to compile and lint this project. So once again, let's come back to the closure web page, which is by the Google developer team, and take a look at it. The first thing that we will look at is the lint page, which is really simple. So what is a lint? As it says, it checks JavaScript style issues such as operator placement, missing semicolons, spacing, and other stuff. So if we go to the how to use closure linter, it will tell us very easily on how to kind of download it. The way I did it was this just one liner, which is sudo easy install for Mac OS, and I basically followed the instructions here. I also went ahead and I installed this Sublime package manager, which is called Sublime Closure Linter. So let's come back to our Sublime text after having installed the Closure Linter package, and now we will install the Sublime package that supports the lint for closure. So to do that, I'll first do Shift Command P and then install package, and over here I will look for Closure Sublime Linter. There you go, and I'll just click enter. Closure Linter is installed. So to access it, we will go to Tools, Lint, and then Run Closure Linter, and there you go, we have a few errors here. The great thing about the Closure Linter for Sublime Text is also that when we kind of hover over the error, it will bring us to the exact line here. So I'll just press escape, and this time, just after the linter, we will now go on to the closure compiler, which is the big part of this episode on Build Podcast. So what is a closure compiler? It basically compiles our development or authored code in JavaScript and makes it better in terms of optimizing it, removing dead code, removing including white space and so forth. And there are a few ways of doing it. Basically, there are 3 ways of doing it. The first way is through the command line, which we will do it later on. The second way is through a web application, and the third way is through a RESTful API. Let's first check out the web application. So to access the web application, let's just go through Closure Compiler Service UI. And when we do that, the Google developer team has written a very clean guide for us to do it. Basically, I picked up all of this from here. So I'm just going to click to this website called closure-compiler.appspot.com. This is where we can see how the Closure compiler will compile our code. Basically, as you can see, they have a very simple code over here. So let's just click white space, which means to say that all they will do is to remove white space and click compile here. There you go. They will just remove only the white space. If we do formatting pretty print, let's see what will happen. So this just means that they will keep the indentation and the new lines, but notice that if I have comments like all this, add your code here, they will be removed. So let me just take away the pretty print. Next, what I'll do is a simple optimization. As you can see, the optimization will also kind of make it into one line, but notice something here. Did you notice that the variable name, for example, function hello name, has been changed to function hello a, which means Closure compiler also can make some kind of substitution to variable names. And this is a great feature of Closure compiler because it carries out obfuscation, which means hiding of intended meaning in communication, making communication confusing, ambiguous. So let's just say you have created an app and you do not want other people to copy your logic. Well, Closure compiler might give you a big layer of hindrance for other people to reverse engineer it. So obfuscation, okay, I can't even pronounce it, is really a great feature of Google Closure compiler. Lastly, I will go through this advanced optimization. Let's see what it does. And I'll just keep it to pretty print so that we see what's going on. And after I press compile, notice that the entire function has been stripped off into just one line, which is basically what you would expect from this command here. So that's what an advanced optimization does. It not only strips off the white space as well as the new lines and comments, it even goes and optimizes the logic inside it. So this is really powerful. The other thing that I like about the web interface is that it immediately tells you what is the final size. For example, the original size was 90 bytes. Now we have 26 bytes, and imagine the savings, 71.11%. Now you might be wondering, how is this useful? The reason is very obvious. If we go to google.com and we view the page source, we will notice that everything here is minified. Basically, they are using Closure compiler. So if we do a little command F, so if you see var here and you kind of search here, you will see var b, var h, var d. It kind of doesn't make sense at all, but it is definitely very highly optimized. And if you look at the entire source code of google.com, it is pretty short comparatively. And why not? Because basically millions and billions of searches are going on every single month, and the Google developer team has to ensure that it is optimized to the maximum level. Google developer team has developed a second method, which is called the Closure Compiler Service API. So why don't we go ahead and look at that? So let's firstly, as instructed here, create an HTML page for Closure Compiler test.html. Copy the entire thing and paste it here. Now notice here, even before we look at this file in the browser, the input type, hidden, compilation, white space only, output format, output info, these look familiar. So firstly, the immediate thing we will do is just open up this in the browser, and this will give us a very similar looking interface. But guess what? This is running in our local host, just calling the API. So let's optimize it, and there you go. They will give you the optimization. But of course, now if I go ahead and change white space only to advanced, something like this, and if we come back here, refresh the page, and now if we click optimize, the similar looking advanced optimization code will be here, just like what we saw in the web version. But of course, in our daily development environment, we will not be using this method as well. So finally, we will go through Clojure compiler application. So this is basically a command line interface to run our compiler with some of the options. So firstly, how do we do that? We will go ahead and download the compile.jar. So I'm just going to click it here. I'll come back to my desktop, and over here you see the compiler.latest.zip is downloaded, and I'll open up this one, and this is the file that we are looking for. So I'm just going to copy compile.jar. Next, I'm going to go back to the project folder and I'm going to paste it. So very good. Now you can see I have index.html, script.js, and then compile.jar. Now the very first thing that will be very useful is to do the help command, which is java-jar compile.jar --help. And this was basically how I picked up many of the commands that I can use for Clojure compiler. So let me clear the screen. The next command that I'm going to paste in has two options. The first option is --js, which means what is the input file. As you saw, our input file is script.js right over here in the same folder structure as compile.jar. Obviously, if you have it in another folder inside, let's say JS folder, you have to have js/script.js. So it's all about relative reference to the folder or directory. And the next option is --js_output_file, which means what is the file name. And for us, I'll just name it as script.min.js. So I'm going to come back here and just enter. And now when we look at the folder structure, we will see script.min.js. Let's test it out. So before we do that, we will come back to the index.html. Do make sure that the correct script file is referenced. And now I will go ahead and open it up in the browser. Try out a cool CSS color. Yep, it seems like it's working. Yep, so there you go, it has been created. Obviously, it has gone through some of their own default options, for example, white space and so on and so forth. Let's go ahead and change around those options and play with them. So I'm going to put in the same command, but this time I will put in an option which is compilation_level. Instead of advanced optimization, why don't I put in white space only? And now when I come back to script.main.js, it looks pretty similar, but obviously the optimizations were not done. So it's a little bit longer. Let's play around with another option. Notice that I have about 5 lines, and now when I come back and instead of white space only, I try out the advanced options. The 5 or 6 lines that we previously had is now only 3 lines. So basically it has gone through a lot of rigorous optimization. So while this is a great way to do our compilation, sometimes we would want some warnings as well to be displayed if it is available. So I'm going to include one more option, which is called warning_level, and I'm going to put it as verbose. When we do that, notice that it will give us one error, which means to say that, hey, variable dollar is undeclared. The $sign is definitely coming because we are using the jQuery library, but the compiler does not know where to find this. For that, we need to use something called the externs option. Firstly, in order to use the externs option, we will go to the jQuery library that the Clojure compiler uses, and it is hosted in the SVN trunk of the Clojure compiler. So I'm just going to copy the entire code here, and I'm going to come back to my text editor, and this time I'm going to create a file called jQuery.clojure.js, and let me just paste in all of this. So why do we need to use an extern? So like it explains here in the guide, it says that if you use a third-party JavaScript library, and in this case we are using jQuery, you need to be sure that Clojure compiler doesn't rename the symbols. And basically that's why we have a mapping library for jQuery Clojure to help us do that. I will run the previous command. Now I'm going to put in the externs option. Alright, so there was no warning, and let's go back to our script.main.js. Yes, it is cool that it has created it. Next, we will do something a little bit different. Now notice I have commented out every time there is a console.log. Why don't we go ahead and reveal, or rather uncomment, all these lines? So I'm just going to search for console.log, find all of them, come back, and and then just take away the comments. And with this, let me just save it, and I'll come back to the command line and just go through the exact same command. Now notice here, immediately it will give us this error called variable console is undeclared. Now why is this happening? If we go to the documentation, it is happening because there are warnings when the variables are not declared. So we would want to turn it off. And to do that, we will make use of another new option, which is JS_comp_off. So let's go back to the command line, and this time, along with the rest of the command, I will also put in a new option. And now when we do that, notice that this type of warning related to variable undeclared is turned off, and therefore it will not give us this warning. When we press enter, yes, it's happening, and lighter and darker, but obviously because I have enabled all the console.log, it is giving me all the debug parameters. So I'll just quickly go ahead and comment it back. So save it. So I am inside my browser, and when we go to the sources, notice that we have access to script.min.js. So to enable source mapping, we will first go to the settings and then general, and make sure that enable source map is checked. After this, we will input two options for our compiler. So I am inside my command line once again, and notice that the number of options are still there, and quite a bit, and I'm going to add in two more options. The first one is called create source map. Create source map has the parameter which is create script.min.js.map. Basically, we were giving a name to the map file that it will create, and the next option is source map format, which is a version 3. So let me just enter it, and when we do that, now it will create, along with the script.min.js, another file called script.min.js.map. This is typically in a JSON file. Let's have a look at it, and it will have basically the information to our authored code. So let's look at our script.min.js as well. It will look exactly the same, but we will add in just one line of comment right at the end. So when we add in this line, this basically tells us that, hey, this file.map contains the information on how to relate this entire code of minified, super optimized bunch of code back to our authored code, which is right here. So after we do that, let's come back to the browser and refresh it. And when we do that, notice that along with the script.min.js, which of course once again has the last line of comment here, it will give us right to our source file. Isn't that very neat? Of course, over here all our breakpoints and stuff will also work with limited features. For example, variables and watch expressions are not found. So let's come back to our command line and examine our command in this case. As you notice, it is really very long, and of course we do not want to be doing this every time we make a change and then we compile and so on and so forth. Also, with such a big long line, we can make mistakes somewhere. So why don't we look at another option to get this? And for this we will use grunt. So what is grunt? Grunt is a build tool to create a lot of tasks. For example, if you want to delete something, you want to lint something, go through some testing, as well as, guess what? Yes, closure compiler. So we are going to use this closure compiler grunt.js plugin and put in all the options in one file and use grunt to run closure compiler. So I have already gone through grunt in episode number 21. So if you do not know about grunt.js, do look at this before going further. So to use grunt, we will firstly ensure that grunt is installed globally. So for that will be sudo npm install -g for the global flag, and then grunt. Of course, I have already done that. And so to check whether I have done that properly, you can just do npm view grunt and then version. So I am running at a stable version of 0.3.17. There is already a very cutting edge version, the release version, that is 0.4. So you can try out that as well. So once we have that, we will just do grunt file, and they will ask us a bunch of questions, but we can just give them all no. And yes, a little grunt.js file will be created. So let's go ahead and look at it. This is the grunt.js file. So once again, I'm going to remove all the comments, and inside the grunt init config, basically just going to remove everything because we are not using JS hint or whatever. So the entire grunt init config, I can replace it by just the Clojure compiler. So notice here what's happening inside the Clojure compiler. I am having the path, which I'm going to install right away, and then I'm going to give them an input file, which is basically exactly the same as our command line interface. So if we go back to a few commands back, we will notice that --js was an option, and we have input that option in a file now, and there you have the JS output file with the other options that we went through: externs, warning level, JS comp, even create source map format, which is version 3, so on and so forth. Next, I will ensure that right at the end, the default task only has Clojure compiler, because for the sake of simplicity of demoing just Clojure, I'm just going to include the Clojure compiler. Now the next thing we have to do is actually install the Clojure compiler grunt plugin. So to install the Clojure compiler of the grunt version, I'll just go to the npm website and just copy this. So let me come back to my command line, and in the project directory, I'll just do npm install grunt Clojure compiler. In the meantime, let's go to the main repository page, which is right at the GitHub. So over here, as you can see, they will give us some instructions, and that is where I basically got some of the options and how to write it. So after we have installed it, let's go ahead and add in this line in our grunt file. So I will add it right at the top here because I have already done an npm install. Let's just check whether it's done. Yep, it is done. And lastly, let's go ahead and run it. As you can see, it is basically looking for a file inside Clojure build and then compile.jar. So why don't we go ahead and create that folder structure? So I'm going to copy this and create a folder called Clojure. And inside here, I'll just create another folder called build. And inside the build folder, I will go ahead and paste compile.jar. Why don't we go ahead and run it now? Looks like the Clojure compiler is running with grunt, and it is done without errors, and it even created a report for us. So let's go ahead and check out those files. Yep, we have report with 2 warnings, and the map file is created, and so is the script.min.js. Notice that the last line of comment has been removed. This shows that grunt has taken place. And I'll of course go ahead and add it back because Clojure compiler, I believe it does not yet add the source mapping URL. I might be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. So yep, so that's a bit about grunt. It is very easy because imagine you do not have to keep on typing the long list of options in the command line. You can just store it in the grunt file and just run grunt. And lastly, for a few of the links that will come in handy for us to learn more about Clojure compiler or generally the Clojure tools. Firstly is this Stack Overflow, where I got to know how to use the externals and so forth. And then there is also JavaScript continuous integration with Google Clojure, just written less than a year ago. Do have a read at this article as well. Next is of course the grunt Clojure compiler that we used for our project. And if you are using require.js, basically if you're having a lot of script files, in this example obviously I had only one. If you're using a lot, you probably want to use some kind of AMD module pattern to kind of load all the JavaScript files with proper dependency. So Sebastian here has created the grunt require.js plugin, so do go ahead and try that out. And lastly, for the project, I hope you found it useful. Just a very simple one, and lighten and darken, and I just love playing with the CSS color names as well if you want to know them. Douglas Crawford has created a little fun page about it. And finally, for the build link of the episode, it is HN Pod. It is basically about 30 to 40 minutes of podcast. It is hosted by Michael, and it basically it's a talk show about all the top stories in the Hacker News. I'm sure as developers and hackers and programmers, we go to Hacker News a lot for our news. But if you want a summary of what's happening in the past week, do go ahead and subscribe to HN Pod over the RSS or the iTunes, or even be a guest if you want to. So very fun podcast. I always listen to it during my commuting time. And that's it for this week's episode of Build Podcast. Yes, we are 30 episodes. Thank you so much for the 200 of you over the world that has subscribed to this. You can go through all the 5 channels of subscription you are used to or you're happy with, and I will see you next week. Here's to another 30 more episodes and me learning and sharing. Thank you so much, everyone. Goodbye.